I can't hear you.
You could hear me before, right?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Can you hear me now, Jody?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
I think Jody just froze.
Mom just left.
So we're live on YouTube, but we aren't recording yet.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I am sending the link to Eliza as we speak.
Sounds good. So then, Jason, are they recording sermons and putting them on YouTube?
We have been taking, I think we have maybe a couple cloud recordings of sermons, but we didn't record last week's because the request from the speaker, because they were a missionary and they could potentially get in trouble if there's some recording out there identifying them. So we don't have last week's, but we should be recording other ones. Yeah.
Okay. So the sermon I did 2 weeks ago, is that on YouTube?
I don't know if it's on YouTube. It might just be in our like Zoom cloud account. I'll have to check on that one.
All right. Because I was going to send it to my dad at some point. But don't worry about that today.
Are we muted?
Not at
No.
all.
Oh.
I don't know.
Dang.
I don't know where it is on the iPad phone.
Mute yourself.
Oh, ups.
Ouch, Judy, you poked me in the eye.
So what I'm going to do is introduce the Sabbath School, introduce the chapter, and I felt this chapter in Numbers, I mean, the chapter is based on Numbers 25, is only 16 verses long, or 17 verses long. So I was going to just read it. I think that would be okay, because it does bring out some stuff that Ellen White, didn't bring out totally, I think. And then I was going to have JC start with what were your first impressions on this chapter, and then I'll open it up to Jody and Dad in whatever order you want, and then we'll try to kind of go from there. Sound all right?
Yes, that sounds fine.
Jody, JC, can you turn just slightly so that ceiling thing, there you go. That's better.
John, do you think I should change my shirt to a red one or something different? This makes it look like a black person sitting in a black chair, like I just have a head and that's all.
No, you're fine. You can see the difference. Jody, I can only see you from the nose up again.
I just noticed something. I was curious, John, at I guess it must be your motto or something. It says love, disciple, and shore. I was trying to figure out why is it shore? And it's probably because you're on the ocean. But then I noticed just now that it's share, actually, isn't it?
Yes. Yep.
We are in fact live. We just got the text.
So we are live. So Jason said to give it a minute or two to make sure.
We are live. Did I didn't get a text from Eliza that she shared the link out yet though.
No.
I just got mine.
With the church. Oh, you did get it?
Yeah.
You got one from Eliza?
Yeah.
Well, I got one
Or from the
text.
church like text.
It
yeah.
says church.
Okay. You're good to go.
All right, we're good to go. Good morning, East Side, Seventh-day Adventist Fellowship, Sabbath School. It is March 27, 2021, and it is not a clear day, but at least not a rainy day. So I hope everyone's having a good morning. And I have with me, I'm John Griffin. I'm a member at Eastside SDA Fellowship, and I have my wife, Jody, give us a wave. And my son, John Christian, give us a wave. And then from Portland, Oregon area, I have my dad, give us a wave. Also John Griffin with us today. And the chapter we're going to be discussing, just so everyone knows, we are going through Patriarchs and Prophets. We're on chapter 41, and it's entitled Apostasy at the Jordan. So just to give a little background, the last chapter, which was chapter 40, was titled Balaam, and tells the story of Balaam being asked by the king of Moab to curse Israel, and then Balaam not being able to curse Israel. And in fact, blessed Israel. And so that's what they talked about last week. And this chapter starts out with the sentence, with joyful hearts and renewed faith in God, the victorious armies of Israel had returned from Bashan, and they had already gained possession of a valuable territory, and they were confident of the immediate conquest of Canaan. So Israel is literally across the river from Canaan. They're across the Jordan. They can see Jericho. And I'm going to read, so it's a fairly short chapter. And so just for context, I'm going to read Numbers 25, which is what this chapter is based on. And then we've all read chapter 41, Apostasy at the Jordan. And we will, at that point, move into discussion on the chapter from Patriarchs and Prophets. So while Israel was staying at Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women and invited them to the sacrifices. Who invited them to the sacrifices to their God? The people ate and bowed down before these gods. So Israel joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against him. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's judges, each of you must put to death those of your men who have joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor. Then an Israelite man brought to his family a Midianite woman right before the eyes of Moses and the whole assembly of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear through both of them, through the Israelite and into the woman's body. Then the plague against Israel was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, for he was as zealous as I am for my honor among them, so that in my zeal I did not put an end to them. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites. The name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, the leader of a Simeonite family. And the name of the Midianite woman who was put to death was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, a tribal chief of a Midianite family. The Lord said to Moses, treat the Midianites as enemies and kill them, because they treated you as enemies when they deceived you in the affair of Peor, and their sister Cosbi, the daughter of a Midianite leader, the woman who was killed when the plague came as a result of Peor. So that's Numbers 25, which this chapter is based on. So we're going to be discussing chapter 41, apostasy at the Jordan. And we'll start with the question, what were your first impressions after reading this chapter? And let's start with John Christian, the youngest member of our group.
So the thing that confused me a little bit was just how quick the timeline was between them getting to where they were and then them like sinning, essentially. Because to me, it seemed like it was remarkably fast, but I don't know if that's like in actuality or if that's just how the text displays it. And then through the chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets, it is interesting how in depth she goes with the idol worshiping. So I think that was just something that I noticed because lately I've been largely in the New Testament as I've been taking a New Testament class in college, but it was an interesting time to just go back to the Old Testament and read about this.
So the time frame on page 454 in the first full paragraph, it's talking about Moses preparing for the occupation of Canaan, and then a little farther down, it says, before many weeks have elapsed, their history was marred by the most frightful departure from virtue and integrity. So it sounds like it was at least weeks. Now, whether it was a week or 2 or 3 or, 6 to 8 weeks or who knows how many weeks. So that was kind of the time frame. Any Jody, what are your takes? Well, first of all, John Christian, you said it was good to get back into the Old Testament and a story. What about the story did you like? What about the story didn't you like?
I think that it was a little bit revealing because, especially up until this point in my life, it's just kind of been like a gray patch because, like when you're younger, they're talking like, oh, Exodus, the Israelites are leaving. And then it's like, oh, Jericho, they're going into the promised land and they're taking like what God promised them. And then, so it was interesting to read about that like in between area because there's not a lot of exposure to it when you're younger. And then there wasn't really anything I didn't like. It was just a learning experience all around.
So it's an interesting what you were saying, an in-between area, because it is a transition. You have Israel coming out of Egypt, having a chance to go to Canaan immediately and sinning, and God turning them back, and for 40 years weeding out this group of Israelites, and them coming back to the Jordan and having another chance to go into Canaan. And I can't help but think in a lot of ways we are similar to Israel in that we are waiting for the promised land, i.e. Jesus coming back to take us home to heaven and the new earth. And in a lot of ways, we are in an in-between area, an area of transition. Now, those are big transitions, but there's other transitions we have. And a lot of times it's day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year. So let's be thinking about that for a minute. But Jody, what jumped out at you in this chapter?
I think, well, the comparison between Numbers 25 and then this chapter, in Patriarchs and Prophets, they don't ever mention like the amount of people who died at this junction, which it does in the Bible of 24,000, which is a lot. They mention like, oh, many people died, but it doesn't really give you the magnitude. So that was an interesting comparison. The other, so up the first part of the chapter, my thought was like, why can't these people figure it out? Like they're so close yet so far every time. And so once again, I was like, they're so close, and then they goof up once again and can't seem to get it right. But I don't think that's any different from us. And then there's a part in there where in the chapter, it's pretty harsh on women. And the seducing powers of women. And so it's a little harsh on women for a little bit, but then it gets back to like, basically anyone can be tempted, and it goes through like, basically there's like some kind of admonitions here of like, being careful of what things that we are so sucked in today, even in our own time, about what we read, what we watch, what we listen to, to kind of wrap it up. So those were kind of my overall overarching, I guess, thoughts.
Yeah, so that's part of the reason I wanted to read chapter 25, because I think Ellen White kind of hints at the sexual nature of this sin, whereas the Bible just comes straight out and says it. I mean, it's the first sentence. It says, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women. And so it very clearly says what happened. And I thought it was interesting because as you read through the chapter in the Bible, it talks about men engaging in sexual immorality. And then it goes on to say, the people ate and bowed down before the gods. So all of a sudden it's more than men, it's the people. And then it ends by saying Israel joined in worshiping the Baal of Peor. Now the Baal of Peor I actually looked up is basically just linking Baal and the mountain of Peor where they worship Baal. But Baal was very much a kind of a general classification for God at the time, the pagan god, obviously. But it was the god of rain in a lot of ways, which produced the crops, but it was also the god of fertility, which obviously was related to crop production, but a little bit more than that, fertility in general with herds and animal fertility, which would include human fertility as well. But before we get too far along, I've been taking notes, and you're right, Jody, it did mention the numbers a little bit more significantly in the Bible chapter. 24,000 was quite a few. And I think Ellen White comments that this was kind of the leftover people from the 40 years that hadn't died yet were numbered in that 24,000 to some degree. And then very much, you mentioned the admonition of how this relates to us. Ellen White talks about sin in the present day, and a lot of it having to do with our entertainment, I think. At least that's my take on it. But I'm glad you're here because you did talk about the women. And in a lot of ways, there was the seduction of the women, but the sin seemed to be a reminder of men's involvement with it. And the men were the ones, succumbing to the seduction. So, Dad, what were your initial thoughts on this chapter? And then we'll start breaking it down and going through it a little bit more.
Well, I'll have to admit that I was thinking along the same line as Jody was regarding the fact that Ellen White seems to point out that it was the women that were seducing the men, and that's where the problem started. And that if it wasn't for those women, the Israelites wouldn't have gotten into trouble. And I will admit that when I was younger, at least, that if a woman got abused or raped or something like that, then the question was, well, what was she wearing? And if she had a short skirt on, was that then seductive? And then it was really her fault and she was getting what she deserved. And I can remember my mom telling me that when she, and that was 80 years ago, that she was criticized by some of the members of her church because she wore short skirts and nylons and lipstick. And that was, of course, unacceptable at that time. And in fact, her skirts were short, even by today's standards. And so the question is, okay, then was it the women? Well, then in other places it says, well, it's that Balaam. Now Balaam, he suggested to the Israelite, to the Moabites and the Midianites, that what they ought to do is seduce the men. Now, that seems a little strange because it doesn't even mention that in the Bible, in the Old Testament. It does mention it in Revelation. It says that we've got to watch out for the sin of Balaam. But let's just think about this. Now, I was born in a logging camp where there were a lot of men that went to town on the weekends. And when I worked on the farm, there were a lot of farm hands that went to town on the weekends. And I'm just thinking, if you took a bunch of men and women, as far as that goes, and took them and spent 40 years out in the desert and then brought them into a place where there was lots of food and grapes and fruit and wine and music and beautiful women, I don't know whether you would have had to have Balaam tell them, hey, you ought to get involved with the women get involved. I think that kind of, maybe just happened naturally, or something that would not be just wildly unexpected. So then the question in my mind is, okay, then why is it that Balaam is condemned? Because it looks like to me in reading Numbers that everything he did was okay. And I don't see, what the fault is. Was he introducing something that was really something nobody had ever thought of?
Well, it's interesting, and that's a good question. Because it appears that the fall of Israel in this circumstance was significantly different from their fallings in the past. And if you look at the story of Israel, they leave Egypt, and their first encounter with something bad happening to them is when Pharaoh and his army approaches them and basically traps them at the sea, the Red Sea. And they're screaming at Moses, we would have been better off just staying there. So it was an attack, a physical attack against them. Early on, they had no relationship with God and almost no relationship with Moses. God gets them through. And then within a matter of days, it seems like, all of a sudden their next problem is they don't have water. And then in a matter of days or weeks, they don't have food. And then those seem to be recurring themes off and on. They get to the promised land, it seems like about 2 years later, and they send in the spies, and they're overwhelmed by the impossibility of taking over. And God turns them back for 40 years. And then they kind of then all of a sudden the temptation is, who is the true leader? Is Moses a true leader, or should the other leaders be the true leaders? And this starts with Aaron and Miriam to some degree, but then it goes on to the other leaders, the most notable ones being, I'm skipping on their name, but the ones that the ground opened up and ate them, and that included a whole bunch of other people. And now they've gotten through that, and they've had Balaam try to curse them, which didn't work. They've had some success with fighting these nations, and they finally have the courage to, cross the Jordan. And so it seems like something totally different had to happen. And Ellen White's pretty clear that, on page 454, that third full paragraph, it says, at Balaam's suggestion, a grand festival in honor of their gods was appointed by the king of Moab, and it was secretly arranged that Balaam should induce the Israelites to attend. And so we don't have a full picture what's happening behind the scenes, but it's almost like what happened with Joshua once they got in the promised land. They got tricked into not wiping out the Midianites, I think it was. Is that correct? Where they show up, we've been traveling for weeks and months, our bread's all moldy, and we want to make an alliance with you. And they didn't turn to God to get the truth, and they accept the alliance, and then they find out later, well, these guys were the next ones in line to get wiped out. Well, in this case, it sounds like Balaam had the women coming into camp and developing some friendships, presumably with the women, the Israelite women, and then ultimately coming in contact with the men, but then getting enough of a friendship that they can get invited to this grand festival. I mean, it's not, it's a little, that's how the patriarchs and prophets kind of, you know, set things up. In Numbers chapter 25, I mean, it kind of goes straight to, you know, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite women. And it doesn't really put Balaam as the one to instigate it, although Balaam does get wiped out at the end when all the Midianites get wiped out. But it seems like, you know, it was probably a combination of the two to some degree. You know, some contact had been made and relationships had developed, whether for good or for bad, and ultimately it was for bad. So I don't know. I mean, it does seem like a little bit more of a covert mission as opposed to what they've encountered before. And they certainly fell, and they fell hard. The thing that struck me as interesting in reading this is that Moses was preparing for the occupation of Canaan, knowing that he wasn't going there. And at least from patriarchs and prophets, it sounded like a lot of this stuff was happening without him even knowing about it. And he's obviously busy, he's doing God's work. And in some ways it implies that the Israelites weren't busy. You know, they were kind of in this, like JC was saying, you know, kind of in this transition, no man's land. You know, they weren't, well, they were still in Canaan, but they were still in the desert, and they're waiting to move into Canaan. And it almost implies in patriarchs and prophets, at least, that it was this downtime that led to some boredom, that led to, you know, a loss of focus in what they were supposed to be doing. And then ultimately that loss of focus led to, you know, an interest in the surrounding people. And then these, you know, this ultimate fall that appears to have occurred around the festival with the wine and the revelry. And, you know, it started with exposure, and then they let their guard down, and then it became, you know, complete and total involvement.
But that's like a part of when at the latter part of the chapter, when it gets into more admonitions, that's when it is talking about like when we're content, which is like when technically nothing is going on, then that's when temptation is like able to get us at its best, is when we think that everything is fine and there's really nothing. I guess maybe boredom might be one thing, but when there's really nothing big, I guess, going on. So it's kind of leaps to that as well.
So do we see that happening to us?
John,
Sure.
The other thing is that it seems like to me that there were some things leading up to it. I mean, they'd had 40 years of manna. You know, some people would have gotten tired of manna by then. And it even mentions that they got tired of manna. Well, they now all of a sudden had grapes and all kinds of fruit. They had all the steak they could want. I mean, this was a time they were in a campground that was very plush. They had water available. I mean, this was really a good place for them. And they were really happy because they could see that things were about ready to go. So that it seemed like to me that, yes, they weren't doing a lot of work, but it was just a time of relaxation and saying, man, you know, this has been bad, but we're finally getting to a place where we can see things are going to be good. So let's just kind of, you know, have a little wine, women, and song.
Yeah, I mean, both describe this valley of Shittim as being kind of an open space with the acacia trees, or those big tall trees you kind of see in Africa that have a lot of trunk, and then the canopy kind of at the top, and they're spread out fairly widely, so there's a lot of shade. And then apparently there's a big transition once you cross the Jordan. All of a sudden you get into a little bit more of a tropical area with palm trees, and that's why, you know, Jericho was called the city of palms. So I mean, how does ultimately, how do you justify the contentment. I mean, everyone wants contentment to some degree, but then at the same time, it seems to be a situation that'll expose you to possibly, falling to sin. And then, how do we avoid that from happening, and what can we learn from this situation, I guess?
Well, John, just to keep it a little more simple, another interesting thing is, where did this idea that Balaam led them into sin come from? You really don't get that out of Numbers, that's for sure. Right. And really, Revelation just mentions it slightly. So then the question is, how do we know about that? How did we find out about that? Well, if you look up on Google, you'll find out that it tells there that, in fact, this concept came from the Jewish literature that came on later on. And so then the question in my mind is, where were the Jewish scholars trying to justify what the Jews did by saying it was really Balaam, because he's not a Jew. He was a prophet. He was a prophet of God, but he was one of those other prophets. And so they're just trying to shift the blame to him. Now that makes sense for me. That still doesn't say then, okay, then what was it that Balaam did wrong that they brought up in Revelation?
So the Jews were kind of throwing Balaam under the bus to protect themselves, is what you're saying?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Because I can't believe that nobody thought of, that just, the Balaam to suggest to Balak that what they ought to do is have the women get involved with it. That just doesn't make sense to me. This is something that people can think of all on their own. They don't have to have anybody tell them that. What I'm wondering whether Balaam's fault was that he ever in the first place, just to make money, would come down and, curse Israel. Now, he didn't curse Israel. He even told Balak he wasn't going to curse Israel, and he never did curse Israel, and he didn't get paid. But I'm wondering whether that was actually the sin that was. That is, that he started off on a mission that was bound to be a disaster.
Well, yeah, clearly it ended in his death once the Israelites decided to take out Midian. The one thing that is a little confusing is that this chapter starts out with Moab, with the sexual immorality with Moabite women. So it starts out with Moab, but then it ends with Phinehas killing a Midianite woman. And I tried to look up, and obviously they're fairly closely connected and intermingled, the pagan people compared to Israel. But it was kind of, I thought it was interesting that it ended with the grandson of Aaron killing this Midianite woman, the Israelite leader and the Midianite woman. And then the Bible saying that atonement was made by that act. And so that might be a little too far of a stretch from what we've just been talking about. So let's not go there yet. But I think Dad is talking about the improbability of Balaam showing up to Balak and the Moabites for the third time, it would sound like, and saying, hey, I have a better idea that might work compared to, me originally not wanting to be involved, but really wanting to be involved, and then me trying to curse him and then ended up blessing him. I don't think this started out as sexual immorality. It just couldn't have. But I could see Balaam maybe saying, hey, maybe if we become friends with them, we can find, a weakness, or through a friendship, we can get some protection. And I see this as maybe starting out that way more, because I don't think, I'm sure it can happen, but sexual immorality doesn't usually start out as sexual immorality. It starts out as something else, an idea of sin, a smaller sin and then ultimately leading to a greater sin, assuming sexual immorality is the greater sin that led the Israelites, to this apostasy at the Jordan. What are your thoughts on that as being what happened to cause this downfall of Israel?
Okay. I think that you're right in that it probably didn't start out as sexual immorality, but I also don't think that the gap between like the original sin and sexual immorality was that big of a gap, because we can see that in today's life that transition doesn't take very long. You can see that with like a lot of people who end up cheating on spouses. There's oftentimes not a large gap, but then it also, with the Israelites, I don't think that there was a large gap simply because they'd been in the desert for 40 years. And I think that they were kind of sick and tired of it. So I think that the gap wasn't necessarily a big gap.
Okay. So then you mentioned, some of the things we see today. And I think Jody mentioned early on, there was this admonition that Ellen White has near the end. I mean, what do we see in, she specifically mentions several different areas of entertainment near the end of the chapter. I don't have it right in front of me.
It's like 459, 460, somewhere in
Yeah, there you go. The last two paragraphs of 459 going into 460. I mean, he mentions, the theater, which today would still be, movies, probably more than plays, but also plays. She mentions periodicals, which we don't have magazines so much today that I would consider periodicals, but we have certainly a lot of access to online stuff. And then she specifically mentions near the bottom of that last full paragraph, they hear and read so much of debasing crime that the once tender conscience, which would have recoiled with horror from such scenes, becomes hardened, and they dwell upon these things with a greedy interest. And she's pretty hard hitting in a lot of ways. And so my thought, it was interesting when we first had John Christian as a baby, all of a sudden you had this beautiful, perfect, sinless creature in front of you. And I go to turn on the music, which for me ends up being classic rock most of the time. And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. That's saying a lot more than I want to expose them to, maybe. And, it's something I didn't really think about beforehand. And then same thing, I'd turn on the TV to watch, some of the shows that I was watching. It's like, well, I can't be watching that. And there was just this contrast from what I'd gotten used to all of a sudden what I'm exposing him to. And it really made me stop and think then. And then reading through this chapter, it made me stop and think as well. I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
See, I think that's the real issue there. I was thinking that John Christian mentioned the time frame, and I can't figure out the time frame from this, but there's nothing that says it couldn't have been a year or so.
That's true. I mean,
it could have been a long time. And so that it could have been something that just kind of crept in. They were starting to do business together. They started, intermingling. I mean, I don't think that the Israelites were really just trying to kill everybody. What they were wanting to do is to get access to food and water and safety and just, live life in a normal fashion. And so I think you're absolutely right, John. I think that insidious creeping into a particular way of thinking is what happened. And I feel like that's exactly what is happening even now. I mean, I think that's the same thing, is that we are very gradually, over a period of time, taking on different opinions that in many cases are not necessarily biblically based, even though we like to justify them in a biblical fashion.
You can certainly have seen that politically through 2020 to some degree. and we're still struggling with that. You can see that in entertainment, and we've been seeing that for, decades. But I think more recently with technology, it's opened it, wide open. And, people are literally saying, with all this isolation stuff, thank God for Netflix, because it gives us something to do while we're stuck at home. But you look at a lot of Netflix, and there's been some creeping in entertainment, at least, what kids couldn't have gone to before, as far as movie theaters, and just simply wasn't on TV, is readily available on your computer or your phone with Netflix.
Yeah, I think that, I have over this last couple of years been amazed at how people will change their point of view rather radically. I was reading an article on ethics recently, and this author was saying that we make decisions based on our morals and then justify it by all kinds of different things afterwards. The decision is not really based on evidence. It's based on your impression of morals at that moment, and then you recruit justification for it later on. I can certainly see that happening a lot.
Any thoughts, Jody and JC? Jody, you're a teacher. You got kids kind of at this transition. 8th grade is a transition from grade school to high school. There's a certain amount of contentment, but there's a certain amount of let's get on and get over with this.
Oh, well, for sure. This is the time of year too. I don't think I can be only specific to them. I think it's wider spread than just, middle school age students, for sure. I lost my place where I was thinking of, but that one part that you talked about a few minutes ago, where it's like stuff that used to be abhorrent to us, now we look at it. And I can be kind of a news junkie myself. And sometimes I'm like, oh, what's on the news? It might be horrible stuff. But yet it's the news. And so that's where that's where things kind of get muddied again, where it's I can justify looking at all kinds of garbage because it's the news. Whereas if it was some other form of entertainment, then I might think twice about it. But I think it certainly is problematic. There's one point here, and I don't know if you want me to shift a little bit here, where it's talking about people, and I should have marked stuff up in my book better, but I didn't. Where it's talking about basically when Satan tempts us, those who are in powers of position, and basically the higher you up, the more influence you have over people. Those are the people who Satan goes after, because there's certainly more opportunity if somebody in an influential position, maybe accepts some thought process, or or they have everything. Basically, they're in this period of contentment where they have everything, then they certainly are more susceptible to Satan's temptations, and also Satan gets a stronger hold because they are in a position of influencing more people, and then that basically is a win-win for Satan's purpose. And I thought that was certainly true when you look at specific instances, people in position who, we've talked about this, the higher you are, the harder you fall, or the farther you fall, kind of a thing. So I thought that was interesting that she brought that point out as well.
Yeah, there's no question that leadership has some responsibility to it. And I think God recognized that, because it's very much, it wasn't the leaders of Israel per se, it was the leaders in this apostasy that he directed Moses to have. The judges is what it was called. So it was the leadership of Israel that had stayed true, were responsible for taking care of these people. And they not only killed them, but they did something that is a little unusual in that they exposed them, which in a lot of ways wasn't something you really saw until a lot later, in King Saul and King David's time period, where they would, destroy the king and the king's family and then put them up so that everyone could see them. And in fact, this is one of the first times I really see that happening. And I think the power in this story is that this has happened, and Israel has finally come to their senses, and they're literally at the tabernacle confessing their sins when this guy comes along, Zimri, son of Salu. And it sounds like, it says in the Bible, right in front of Moses and all these people, he takes this lady in. Zimri, the Midianite woman was Zimri, so the woman was Zimri, son of Salu. No, the woman was Cosby, daughter of Zur. So Zimri brings in Cosby, just, I can almost see him looking at him and smiling and waving, and I'm just, going to do what I want to do, and then walking in the tent. And this is when Phineas comes in and just takes care of it. And it sounds like, that's what made the difference to stop the plague that apparently was happening. I don't know if the plague was actually something from God or this was, the judges killing the people, but 24,000 people ended up dying. But I'm still a little fascinated by the idea that this was an atonement for what took place, and atonement bringing people back to God. It required a high level act from the leadership, even after doing what God had said. And God recognized that and honored Phineas, because of that. I don't know why that bothers me. It doesn't bother me too much, but it's outside of what was originally set up for atonement. There was a day of atonement for Israel and a process they went through. And Phineas, in some ways, took things in his own hands, but did it for God, and God recognized that and honored him for it. And I think, ultimately, this needs to come down to what do we need to do to avoid this kind of a situation in our lives. And that brings me back to page 459, the first full paragraph. And it starts out the first sentence, but I want to emphasize the second sentence. It says, "It was when the Israelites were in a condition of outward ease and security that they were led into sin." And I think Jody mentioned that by saying contentment. But the second sentence, I think, directs us to what should have been happening and wasn't happening. They failed to keep God ever before them. They neglected prayer and cherished a spirit of self-confidence. And then later on page 460, the last full paragraph, which is a big paragraph, it's about 2/3 of the way down, Ellen White mentions that this will require earnest prayer, which we already mentioned, and unceasing watchfulness. We must be aided by the abiding influence of the Holy Spirit, which will attract the mind upward and habituate it to dwell on pure and holy things. And we must give diligent study to the Word of God. I think atonement can't be something that happens once a year. It can't be something that happens when something bad happens and we fall flat on our face. I think it does need to happen those times, but I think what needs to happen to keep us from falling flat on our face all the time is that atonement needs to happen every day. And it's by keeping God before you, by staying in His Word, by prayer, and by letting the Holy Spirit work through you.
John, I feel very uncomfortable with this part of it, and I don't know how to justify it, but just throwing out a question, and that is that this is an example of where a church leader saw someone doing something wrong person in leadership was doing something wrong. So they went ahead and killed those people and then left them exposed, laying out on the ground. This sounds like something like I've heard about going on in India, where, you know, a brother will kill a sister because she sinned in some way. And I don't know it. I just don't see Christ doing that. It just seems, when I think of Christ, I don't think of this kind of activity. It seems wrong.
And yet, God speaks to Moses about this, and he basically says, where is that? It's in Numbers 25, verse 10. The Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, has turned my anger away from Israelites, for he was as zealous as I am for my honor among them, so that in my zeal I did not put an end to them. I mean, it almost sounds like another situation where God was ready to put an end to Israel, even though they were right there on the Jordan. And then he says, therefore tell him, I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites, presumably by this act.
I could just see Satan saying, see, this is one of those examples. If you don't do what God tells you, he'll just kill you.
Well, it wasn't God killing them. It was Phinehas, the priest, the grandson of Aaron. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it. But I guess something had to happen to change the direction. And I guess there's a couple parts to this. I mean, as a leader, how often do you see something going wrong, that is blatantly and obviously wrong? And how often do you take a stand against that? I mean, you can look, and I don't want to get too political, but, with the Black Lives Matter stuff that we had to deal with in 2020, there's plenty of people standing up and saying, I'm not a racist. But it turns out that that's a very racist statement to make, because it indicates a misunderstanding of the whole situation and the history behind the situation. And to actually take a stand against what was happening and to support it, you almost have to go the extra length and do something that is anti-racist to counteract the racist things that are happening. And maybe that's what Phinehas was doing. He was taking the extra step beyond just, killing the leaders of this apostasy as God directed. He put an end to the apostasy by killing this leader in the act of apostasy. It's just a thought. I don't have all the answers for sure. But I think too often we see things happen and we just let them happen because it's like, well, that's not going to affect me at my work. It's not going to affect, me at church, especially if I'm not a leader. But even if I am a leader to some degree, it's not going to affect, kids at school because it's, one kid, one family, or it's, one teacher. But maybe we're in a time where in order to end the apostasy that's happening now, we have to take the extra step and make sure that the opposite of what's been happening does happen, to make that statement for God. I don't know.
Well, the other thing is that the culture that they lived in was a culture that was significantly different than the culture we live in. And so it may have taken something like that on the part of God to gain their attention in the first place at all. I don't know. But I just, it's hard for me to believe that that's the kind of activity, even though some people feel that's the way we should work now. It's hard for me to believe that just going around killing people that are doing wrong is not going to be the right way to go.
Well, sadly, this pattern continues even after Israel gets into Canaan. There's this constant turning towards other nations and their pagan gods. And it really ultimately leads to their captivity in Babylon. which is where we start hearing more about, the end of times. And, Daniel and Revelation go hand in hand. That started in Babylon. And it wasn't until they got out of Babylon that they took a hard stand towards the right, in a lot of ways overshot that and became, super ultra religious, but also super ultra isolated. They would not step out and help other people come to God. And that was a problem that Jesus had as well. So we need to be wrapping things up. I don't know. In some ways, I knew we were going to struggle with this chapter because, and in some ways, I didn't want to struggle with this chapter. But I think that in a lot of ways, this could have been avoided. I think that if it had been water or food or another army like the Egyptians attacking them, or even if the Moabites or Midianites had just flat out tried to attack them, this would have never happened. But it was that insidious kind of sin that got into the camp and they got comfortable with, that led them to doing more and ultimately, committing the big sin that God had to take big actions against. And I think we'll know more about this someday. When we're in heaven and have the full story, there might be, obviously there will be more to the story than just this. But I think there's a lesson that can be learned even now, because in a lot of ways, we aren't at a river of the Jordan, but we are at the end of times, and we're in a transition. Jesus has come. He has saved us from our sins. He has promised to come back. And you can say a lot about Seventh-day Adventists, but there has been a lot of waiting, even since 1844 with the Great Disappointment. And there's a lot of people, even now, that are getting comfortable and they aren't worried about the waiting. They're getting comfortable with their life and setting up a life that's very similar to those around them. And I think we need to continue to keep our focus on God. And that'll be what keeps us safe in these times of transition. Through reading the word and through prayer, keeping our focus on God and letting the Holy Spirit work through us. I think those are all things that could have helped the Israelites back then, and they can help us now. Any other thoughts, JC, Jody, Dad?
I just want to say that I really have appreciated the challenge to study this myself. I spent quite a bit of time on it, and I would say that I have found it very rewarding. Not that I have found answers to a lot of things, but I think that it made me think, as you mentioned, about where we're living now. And it seems like to me that we're in exactly the same kind of situation where we can get comfortable doing something that's not right.
Yeah, it's very easy to do, I think. Let's bow our heads and we'll wrap things up. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for these Old Testament stories that you gave us. They are hard because they were centuries ago. And sometimes out of context, they're hard to understand and we don't always have the whole story, but they are challenging and they are showing us that you lead in the best of times as well as the worst of times, and that there is a right even in the world we live in today and a wrong. And I ask that you continue to lead and guide us through your word, through our prayers, and with your Holy Spirit to know what is right and to honor you by doing what is right in all that we say and do. Bless us this Sabbath and bless us as we continue to go through patriarchs and prophets. In your name, amen. All right. I don't know if Jason is still online, but we've wrapped up. So thanks for joining us, Dad, and John Christian and Jody. I think we can just start Xing out.